very happy to be joined as we continue the show here by Kevin Gosztola, who is the managing editor of Shadowproof.com and the co-host of Unauthorized Disclosure, along with, get this, Rania Khalek. Kevin, thanks so much for being with us.
Hello, Kevin. It's so strange to see you on the other side where I get to interview you.
Yeah, it's really good to be with you both.
No, thanks so much for joining. And well, so Ronnie, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, no, it's really, I'm so glad that we get to have you on to talk about this. I think that Kevin is one of the most consistent reporters out there when it comes to covering the plight of whistleblowers. And I think that more than anybody else, you've really been on the story of Daniel Hale and what he's been going through even before we got this news that he's actually, you know, he got sentenced to prison time. So why don't you start by telling our viewers, who is Daniel Hale and what was he prosecuted for?
Yeah, so Daniel Hale is, I mean, we were just talking about the poverty that we have in the United States. And he's not unlike a lot of younger Americans who look around and see very little that they can do in their future because they don't have the means to support going to school immediately out of high school, or they don't have a stable job. They're not really sure how to pursue what they're interested in as a career. And so he entered the US military. And so the poverty draft, which is what we talk about in the United States. And he deployed to Afghanistan. By the way, he joined in 2009. He was deployed in Afghanistan in 2012, 2013, thereabouts. And he's a signal intelligence analyst for the US Air Force. And his job is to do geolocation of people who are on the watch lists or on the kill lists, to identify terrorists, basically alleged terrorism suspects, by connecting them to metadata or by tracking their cell phones and devices that they might have on their persons. And he witnesses drone strikes. It's traumatizing. And he returns home to the United States and is sorting through what to do because of the impact on his conscience. He joins Iraq Vets Against the War. He goes to a Code Pink summit toward the end of 2013. He's now speaking about some of his experiences, and yet he still doesn't have a lot of money, and he wants to go to college, and he realizes that he has a security clearance that he can use to get a pretty cushy job working for the national security agencies. And he sends in his resume and gets a job working at a largely unknown agency called the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. You know, on a very light note, it's a very bizarre agency, I think, to have in existence because their mapping is actually nothing compared to what Google is capable of doing. He recalls like mapping locations throughout the world and then finding it on Google, and it's like they already have this much better. What are we wasting our time doing here as this contracting job? But so in this position, he had access to classified information. He did not know that he was going to, but he did. And that's when there's this moment that he writes very vividly about in his letter to the judge, where some colleagues ask him after work to join them for essentially a war porn viewing session. You know, come, I imagine, let's grab some Doritos and soda pop and let's kick back and let's watch some archived footage of these drone strikes. And it really impacts him. I believe he likely recalled that this was regularly happening when he was deployed in Afghanistan. He didn't want to go back to that. But also, it's a trigger. It makes him decide that he should take some kind of action and provide information to a reporter. And ultimately, he gives documents to Jeremy Scahill. And there's more I can say, but I'll wait and let you guys ask me what you would like to know.
So I'm glad that you brought that up because I'm actually, and I want to say this like in the most collegial way possible, but this is, I think, the third whistleblower to have some sort of connection with the Intercept. I'm not sure if the Intercept or the connection to Jeremy Scahill with Daniel Hale I'm not sure if this was something that they did wrong on their end, because from what I understand, it's still not quite clear how the authorities figured out that he was the whistleblower on this. But I guess, how would you respond to that? It clearly has something to say that, but how would you respond to that broader issue of, this outlet that was founded to literally solicit leaked information? 3 people who've leaked information to them have been sentenced to prison.
It's fairly simple how the authorities could figure it out. Daniel Hale was associating with Jeremy Scahill out in public. And so that immediately puts a target on your back, unfortunately. I mean, I wish that the US government wasn't doing that to people who were sources of reporters, but he himself and other people who have spoken out on the drone program know that they need to be extraordinarily careful about how they speak, because the government will come and try and ruin your life for exercising your free speech. You talk about how we're a libertarian country when it comes to our economics, but we're not very libertarian when it comes to speaking about national security and the things that we do around the globe as an empire. And so any of these people who question their role in the military are looking to be faced with retaliation. And that's essentially what happens to Daniel Hale. I think it's a combination as far as, there are some things that are clear about the Intercept when it comes to the responsibility to protecting their sources, and they failed. The one glaring example in my head that I've talked about is in Citizen 4, Glenn Greenwald slides a piece of paper to Edward Snowden in one scene in that Oscar-winning documentary. And Ed picks it up and he looks at it and he says, "Oh, I hope that person is being careful because that's extremely risky." And they talk about the second Snowden, and they're talking about Daniel Hale. And at the end of the film, Jeremy Scahill mentions that there's another source that's coming forward. And this one is not on surveillance, it's about drones. And so US government's going to watch this film. They're putting a target on the source that is coming forward with these documents, even though they don't know their identity. They know that they need to go look for someone who is taking documents and providing them to the Intercept. And so I'm not excusing. I think we have to kind of hold two views. Like on one hand, there are things that reporters need to do to protect their sources. On the other hand, when we look at the time frame for when a lot of these cases are developing, it reflects the posture of the national security state, that I believe they were actually doing total surveillance of the Intercept and seeking to destroy their capabilities, since they were so effective in publishing Edward Snowden's documents.
Well, let me ask you this on a similar note. I mean, obviously, Edward Snowden's documents broke open so many important things. I mean, what was the importance of what Daniel Hale brought to light in terms of the drone program?
So the importance is in the filings from various organizations that supported him and his defense, and saying that he deserved leniency from the judge. CARE, one of the largest Muslim civil rights organizations, pointed out, and Ghadir Abbas, who represented people who were on the no-fly list, signed on and said, "We used this watch listing guidance document that was released by Daniel Hale." So we've talked about the drone program in relation to Daniel Hale, but many people might not realize that he released a document on how people end up on the watch lists, and then that ends up being that they're on no-fly lists and can't travel. And that has impacted numerous Muslim Americans in this country. And CARE is one of the organizations that has been litigating these cases over the last decade to get people removed, and also to defend their constitutional rights to not be on this list. And were able to be successful because they had a physical document that they could point to prove to a judge that this is what they were talking about. And it's extraordinarily important for people to know that when you go into these civil liberties cases, you have to have something physical in evidence, or usually the judge will say, you're just postulating. You're just saying that this could be. You have to prove that the US government is actually doing this to people, even if you suspect it. And so he did that. And then there's the other fact that, so what we find out from this kind of watch listing thing is like 40 to 50% of people have no relationship whatsoever to any known terrorist groups or organizations. Like, you can find that from the government's own documents. And then from Daniel himself, he says that 9 out of 10 people who are being killed are not terrorism suspects.
Wow.
So they're either civilians or I don't know how else you would classify them.
That's
yeah,
90%.
so either somewhere from 8 to 9 out of 10 people the U.S. government was killing, not militants. And he's the one who we learned from that everyone is being designated as enemies killed in action, EKIA. No matter what, posthumously, they don't go back to check whether they were civilians or not. They're just marking them down as EKIA.
I mean, it really is, shocking, some of those things. 90%. Certainly we're led to believe that everyone, who's targeted by a drone strike, that we have 10 years worth of information proving there's someone bad or whatever it may be. But it also brings me, Kevin, to this idea of him being prosecuted under the Espionage Act, as if he spirited something out and, gave it to someone who used it to blow up something in America. That's what you think about when you think about the Espionage Act, rather than this, which appears to be a critical public service. How can we debate the drone program without this kind of information?
Yeah, so just a little brief history on the Espionage Act, because it's actually extraordinarily, it applies quite a lot to Daniel Hale, given the fact that he was in the military. When we go back to its passage in 1917, the law was originally applied. The first prosecutions, it's like 2,000 to 2,500 people are prosecuted because they are speaking out against the U.S.'s involvement in World War I. It was used in that particular manner. One of the most notorious, well-known cases, I imagine, Eugene, you know this, but I hope Rania does too, is Eugene Debs, who gives a very well-known anti-war speech. And actually, in real time, as he's giving the speech, an early iteration of a spy agency in the United States is doing surveillance of him as he speaks to figure out if he said something that's incriminated, so they can bring a political case against him immediately after his anti-war speech in Canton, Ohio. And actually, we just had the anniversary of that speech a few days ago. And so you connect that through, you do a through line. Daniel Ellsberg, Pentagon Papers, that's against war. You look at some of the more recent cases with Chelsea Manning exposing the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And what you see is that people who are being targeted with the Espionage Act are challenging the way that the U.S. conducts its foreign policy or engages in wars abroad. And so it is not as unusual that the Espionage Act is applied to somebody like Daniel Hale. But what is, to me, still important is that we are talking about using this law to crack down on someone who is a source for a reporter. And we can't lose sight of that fact, that this law is being used to criminalize people who are talking to the press. And it's, it's being used against Julian Assange, WikiLeaks founder. And so what we see in all of these cases that are most popular and most scandalous is that they are going after people who aren't directly giving information to somebody the United States has designated an enemy, an issue that we could deal with separately, on whether we believe that those people should be our adversaries or designated enemies or not. And they're also intending to do damage to the U.S. There's no statement on the part of Daniel Hale that he wants to bring down the U.S. government or overthrow it. But, from what we know, I guess, could we blame him if he felt like it needed to be overthrown at this point after what he's gone through? But there's no evidence of that. It's just giving documents to a reporter, and then that makes you guilty in it. And there's no intent. Again, like everyone's basic understanding of how criminal activity works. And obviously there's a lot of excesses and injustice in our criminal punishment system. But usually when somebody does something that is a crime, you have to prove that they had an intent to commit, or else you don't really have that much of a basis to bring some kind of a prosecution. Or in other words, you have really extraordinary mitigating evidence to make it so that that person won't go to prison for a long time. A common example in these cases is to say, like, a poor person goes and steals that loaf of bread. Well, you're usually going to excuse that because they're hungry and they need to have food to eat. So in this case, he's releasing documents to the public because his conscience tells him that we need to know how this killing machine is operating. And we need to know that the president is lying. I mean, in his letter, which he vividly wrote, and he probably alluded to this in his statement to the court when he received his 45-month sentence, he's talking about the fact that President Barack Obama is on television lying about the U.S. military drone program and the fact that the only people who are killed are those who pose an imminent threat to the United States. And he says, well, that's not a lie. Actually, the standard I have in front of me says if a specific U.S. interest, we get to launch a Hellfire missile at them. What's a U.S. interest? That could be absolutely anything. So,
Kevin, I'd like for you to also speak on the bipartisan nature of this, because this case transcends how many administrations? Is it from Obama to Biden? So it goes Obama, Trump, Biden, all prosecuting the same case against a whistleblower using the Espionage Act?
So what's interesting is there actually wasn't support in the Justice Department for prosecuting Daniel Hale. The defense uncovered a document that's incredible to me, knowing what I know about the war on whistleblowers under Obama. But it seems to me that perhaps there was some kind of memo shared informally or formally in the Obama administration during his second term that, hey, we're developing a bad reputation as like President Kill List or drone warrior in chief. And it might not look good for us if we prosecute Daniel Hale.
Wow.
And so maybe we should back off because this could be bad PR for us. And actually, the Justice Department has, over the last couple of weeks, received some pretty bad PR when it comes to Daniel Hale's case. The New York Magazine article about him, Call Me a Traitor, did phenomenally well, made a huge splash, and contained Daniel Hale's first words. That letter he wrote to the judge got a lot of good press. And so they were not willing to move forward. But then what we see with Donald Trump and his Justice Department is that they step in and the gloves are just off. I mean, I know that's an overused cliche, but they honestly had no qualms about going after anyone, as evidenced by the indictment against Julian Assange, as evidenced by the fact that they went ahead and did this prosecution because Daniel Hale was raided in August of 2014. And then he had this investigation hanging over him for almost 5 years before he finally was indicted. You could say it was quite an abuse of his due process rights because he failed out of school in that time, not knowing what would happen to him. He's lived a life where he hasn't had any stability. Obviously now he's in prison, but in between this time, he wasn't able to find a job or anything that he could hang on to really commit himself. And because he was always thinking about, when is the FBI going to come knocking at my door again? When am I going to be placed under arrest for this? Because I know I'm still under investigation. And so Donald Trump indicts him. And that's just a reflection of the zeal that they had for aggressively pursuing. And then interestingly, we have this very sleazy and bigoted figure in Gordon Kromberg, who was involved in the prosecution of Daniel Hale, was in the room for the sentencing and was there saying very nasty, mean things about Daniel Hale, engaged in some of the worst character attacks. And he's also the prosecutor who's spearheading the prosecution against Julian Assange. So this figure, a known Islamophobe, somebody who you could probably fill a whole half hour with talking about separately from this, was really the driving force behind. And if you'll permit me, I would just like to read one of the more incredible quotes that we got from him, just so you can have a sample of the character assassination. I had this with me today, so I just want your viewers to know that this was written about Daniel, and it was a reaction to the fact that so many of us were viewing him as a whistleblower. And so I know that Daniel Hale says, "Call me a traitor," because he feels like it's an honorable thing that he betrayed his country and the military industrial complex and the wide killing machine. But I call him a whistleblower because I know that's what so irritates the U.S. attorneys who bring these political prosecutions. And so in reaction, they wrote, and it was really incredible. According to Hale, what he did was legally wrong, but morally right. Hale has never acknowledged the potentially serious and in some cases exceptionally grave damage to national security his actions could have caused. Under these circumstances, he cannot be entitled to a reduction in offense level or acceptance of responsibility. So that legal jargon is just saying he's not entitled to a lenient sentence. But this is the thing that's more outrageous. In analogous circumstances, no one would award such a reduction to a heroin dealer who admitted that he violated the law by distributing heroin, but simultaneously asserted that by distributing the heroin, he was helping society rather than harming it. So comparing him
those things
to
aren't
a
the same.
heroin dealer.
No, those things aren't even a little bit the same. I mean, I
Unbelievable.
don't even know how you.
Yeah,
Jeez.
no. Well, I mean, you know, it's smear city. Well, a lot that could be said about this. A lot could be said about this whole issue. I think we'll leave it there for now, but I really appreciate you joining us, Kevin, giving us some of your time, of course, and of course, an overview on what was a tragic conviction, but I think a very important story.
Thank you.
Of course.